Thanks, Tajay. Welcome back to NN News, where you can hear anything and everything going on in the world, if you lived about 1,000 years ago. A few topics of sudden interest have arisen among the population, one being innovations that stimulated agricultural and industrial production in many regions. Some major agricultural advancements occurred in Mesoamerica, including the introduction of terracing techniques, in which the people would create steps along the sides of mountains to make the crop turnout increase for the possibility of a higher population. Another form of agriculture was the chinampas, which meant floating gardens. The chinampas were literally small islands atop freshwater lakes. In response to increasing demand in Afro-Eurasia for foreign luxury goods, crops such as sugar were transported from their indigenous homelands to equivalent climates in other regions. Chinese, Persian, and Indian artisans and merchants also expanded their production of textiles and porcelains for export. There was a large increase in the need for luxury goods in the Western world. Industrial production of iron and steel also increased in China. The fate of cities varied greatly, with periods of significant decline and with periods of increased urbanization, buoyed by rising productivity and expanding trade networks. Factors that contributed to the declines of urban areas in this period included invasions, disease, the decline of agricultural productivity, and the Little Ice Age. The rise of the Mongols led to the immediate fall of many small kingdoms and nearby empires. Fallen empires connected from Russia to China using the Silk Road. Fusing the genetic diversity together and traveling across the Silk Road multiple times led to the mutation of a combination of diseases that led to the Black Plague, the Black Death, or the bubonic plague, which was spread around by rats. The Black Plague killed 50 million people, or two-thirds of Europe's population. Around this time, Europe was also experiencing something called the Little Ice Age, in which people had colder winters. Also, the majority of the population had died from the plague. Many more died due to the harsh conditions brought by the Little Ice Age. Not only was it cold, but the decrease in the temperature caused the failure of crops. Essentially, it was suffering for the Europeans. They had just barely survived a global epidemic, and they were cold and hungry. Not fun. Factors that contributed to the urban revival included the end of invasions, the availability of safe and reliable transport, the rise of commerce, and the warmer temperatures between 800 and 1300 CE. Once the harshest period of the Little Ice Age had ended, the Europeans rebounded back to as they were prior to the plague. After the 14th century, the Mongols had either returned back to their homeland or assimilated into nearby cultures. In doing so, the Silk Road became less popular and led to the rise of Indian Ocean trade. From 1405 to 1433, Zheng He made his expedition to establish relations with foreign nations, and in doing so allowed the Europeans to be aware of the possible route from the western lands to Southeast Asia. As Indian Ocean trade bloomed, the rise of new inventions such as the caravel, junk, and the dhow, which were types of boats, began to sail the seas. While cities in general continued to play the roles they had played in the past as governmental, religious, and commercial centers, many older cities declined at the same time that numerous new cities took on these established roles. Trade routes expanded and new ports opened, causing new cities to increase in population, which eventually made the city a popular hub for new travelers, making the older cities less visited. The plague was at the end of not only men, but animals and harvests too. As men died from the disease, no one was there to take care of the feasts, killing the animals and crops on it. Because of this, starvation fell upon villages and towns, and men lost their manpower and were not able to work. Basic needs like bread were short on supply, leading to inflation. This rise of prices in the economy was hard on the poor, and they could not keep up with it. Peasants that had survived the Black Death were convinced that they were special and that God had protected them from death. This changed the peasants' outlook on life, as they tried to find better wages and even demanding so if a lord was desperate. This went against the feudal system and therefore caused for the government's fury. When the peasants revolted, the government decided to come up with labor reforms to conform to the people's needs. This led to the introduction of socialist ideas, which slowly diffused themselves into newer forms of governments like communism. Despite significant continuities in social structures and in methods of production, There were also some important changes in labor management and in the effect of religious conversion on gender relations and family life. As in the previous period, the main forms of labor organization included the free peasant agriculture, nomadic pastoralism, craft production, and guild organization, along with various forms of coerced and unfree labor, and government-imposed labor taxes and military obligations. After the labor reforms, governments were less of the let the aristocracy do nothing and more of let there be equality. The peasants had a proper pay and were given amenities. Taxes applied to everyone, not just the lower classes. As in the previous period, social structures were shaped largely by class and caste hierarchies. Patriarchy somewhat remained, however, in some areas women exercised more power and influence, most notably among the Mongols in West Africa, Japan, and Southeast Asia. New forms of coerced labor appeared, including serfdom in Europe and Japan, and the elaboration of the mita in the Inca Empire. Free peasants resisted attempts to raise dues and taxes by staging revolts, such as China or in the Byzantine Empire. The demand for slaves for both military and domestic purposes increased, particularly in Central Eurasia, parts of Africa, and in the Eastern Mediterranean. The diffusion of Buddhism, Christianity, and Neo-Confucianism and Islam also often led to significant changes in gender relations and family structure. No longer were people attached to their indigenous cultures, in which rituals dating back hundreds of years governed their current actions. Women were not forced to be submissive to men as much as their religions gave them the right to be equal. The relationships between emperor and subject and the father and son were not as heavily pronounced as had been in Confucianism. Okay, that's all for today. Thanks again. See you tomorrow on NN News. Bye!